Welcome to Let's Talk Global Business, the show in which we look at the economic and business trends connecting the world. I'm Sarah Murray, Managing Director International at the Conference Board, the member-led global think tank that delivers trusted insights for what's ahead. Today, we're diving into the issue of pay transparency. What are the implications for companies that are being required by legislation to disclose what they pay people? We'll be exploring this issue with perspectives from both sides of the Atlantic. Joining me today from Brussels is Marion Devine, Principal Researcher for Human Capital Europe at the Conference Board. And from the US, we're joined by Aaron Brown, SVP Total Rewards at Synchrony Financial. Hi, Marion and Aaron.
Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for having us today.
You're very welcome. So, Marion, to better frame our conversation today, could you tell us a little more about what pay transparency is and why it's a subject of increasing interest to businesses?
Yeah, I think, Sarah, that pay transparency goes hand in hand with equality and gender pay equality. So that's sort of very much the context in which pay transparency needs to be placed. And I think that in so many economies and countries around the world, there is just frustration, really, that pay gaps between men and women are still being very slow to be solved. And so more and more countries are starting to consider pay transparency as a way to try and tackle this issue. It's coming at it in a different way. So we've seen quite a few states in the United States, and Erin will be telling us about this, who have introduced pay transparency legislation. Other countries around the world, Brazil, Canada and Ecuador, and most recently the EU have passed a directive on pay transparency, which will become law in 2026, which really sets very high standards in pay transparency. But it's all about to try and improve gender pay equality between men and women.
Thank you. So which countries have really been pioneers in implementing those pay transparency laws, and what have the outcomes been of those regulations? Marion, can I start with you?
Yeah, well, we have pioneering countries and we also have pioneering companies, and those aren't quite the same thing. But I think within Europe, the countries that have always been regarded as really having a head start are the Nordic countries. So Sweden, Norway and Finland, they have had a long tradition of transparency. And I think what's really interesting about these countries in particular is that they've had transparency, for example, around tax returns. They have a very strong cultural value that official documents should be open to all. So your tax returns can be looked at. So actually individual income has long been open and shared in those countries. Other countries have been really working very hard at gender pay gaps. And so I think in Europe, I would point to France that's had some really great sort of legislation. The UK has been working at it. And then other countries, Japan is really trying to tackle this, but they're all coming at it in different ways and different reasons. But I guess the Nordic countries have to be at the top of the pile, and they certainly have some of the lowest gender pay gaps in the world.
Aaron, from your perspective?
Yeah, so here in the U.S., it's come a little bit after some of the European laws. And I would say even pre-COVID, some of the states started passing laws. You saw in 2019, I guess Colorado passed a law that went into effect in 21. And then we're up to about 10 or 11 states that require some level of pay transparency. And then you even have New Jersey where some of the cities are getting into the mix. And I think it's a positive development that companies are trying to understand and figure out whether there's going to be a consistent approach across whether it's across the entire U.S. or targeted based on state requirements. And then other companies are expanding that globally. So I know we're going to get into some of that later in the call, but some of these state requirements really are helping people understand the pay levels, the pay transparency, the gender differences, if there are any.
Mm. And how do the differences in labour laws and policies across regions or across states affect the enforcement and the effectiveness of pay transparency measures? Maybe I can start with you, Aaron, in the US.
Yeah, so It's almost a kind of a benefit in the United States that we try different things in the different states and then figure out what works and come in sometimes later with kind of the federal overlay. Right now, it is difficult unless you kind of bring everything up to the least common factor and apply it consistently across the U.S., which is actually what we've done at Synchrony. We have pushed a pay transparency and the pay ranges in all of our job openings and offers across the U.S. And with a flexible work arrangement and being open for people to work remotely, we thought that was the best way to handle the situation, and it's been working great. As far as the implications of any sort of penalties that you might have to look at, we just thought it would be easier and simpler to go ahead and be open, be transparent, trust the employees, and we've gotten a lot of good feedback and employee reaction engagement from that.
Oh, that's wonderful. Marion, from the European perspective, how what's
Yeah.
your view on this?
Well, I think that in Europe, we've had a very piecemeal approach to pay transparency and pay equity. And so all the different countries have had their own legislation, some more effective than others. So I think that in Europe, what we're seeing is the EU is really trying to get that gold standard. What's interesting in Europe is that you have to fit that directive onto what's going on in your own countries. So that's where some of the complexity in Europe is. So every country does have its own labour laws. It already has certain standards and procedures for reporting on pay gaps and gender equality, etc. So that's where kind of it gets very hard. The devil is in the detail. What we can say is that the pay transparency directive in Europe is actually a lot more demanding. So it's lowered the threshold for how many employees that you have to report on. It's widened the definition of pay. So it's not just reporting on pay, it's also reporting on the whole range of benefits. It's giving new rights to job candidates to know about the salary range. It's shortened the time where if an employee has some concerns about their pay, it's shortened the period of time that employees have to respond. There are mandatory fines as well. There's more regular reporting on the gender pay gap, and there's enforced action. If you have more than a 5% gap, which many companies will have, you have to outline your plan of action. So all in all, the directive is going to force, higher standards within every, EU country, and companies are going to have to change the way they operate and comply.
Interesting. And the fines in the US, Aaron, is it similar to Europe?
It's still a pretty wide range. So each state is applying their own approach to fines, whether it's by individual cases or a broader set of fines for noncompliance. And I think eventually we'll get some consistency here. But in the meantime, as long as you're kind of applying the most stringent guidelines with respect to pay transparency, then you should be in good shape. And by the way, employees appreciate it because we've gotten a lot of feedback that they want the transparency. They appreciate the fact that the ranges are available for them to see wherever they are in the organization. And it just makes good business sense to do this. It's not just a matter of complying with the laws and making sure that you don't get fined and trying to avoid lawsuits. It really is improving your relationship with employees.
So if we just move a little bit, to talk about the impact of the pay transparency on business and management, what do you think are the top concerns that you're hearing from companies regarding pay transparency? Aaron, in the US, I know you're on one of our councils, and so obviously this is going to be a topic. What are executives most concerned about?
Well, the number one thing that both other companies and also internally at Synchrony executives are concerned about is turnover. So if an employee realizes where they are in the range and they don't feel that appropriately reflects their contribution, or they don't think it's fair, then executives are worried that we might get some turnover. So as we've started looking at this more globally, we have run into looking at individuals, where they are in the range, making sure it makes sense, making sure that the top performers are appropriately aligned before we roll it out. But for the US, which is a little bit ahead of some of the countries that we're in over in Asia with respect to the transparency, we've been going through this for a while, and we are slowly doing the change management, which effectively means that we're given the guidelines, we're given the pay ranges to HR. Then we start telling people managers what those pay ranges are in our HRIS system. And then we actually put it online for all the employees. And if you do that over time and don't make a bunch of fanfare about it, you'll be able to tackle the questions as they come and really address some of these executive concerns about turnover, so you don't have a huge groundswell of issues. You really are tackling it one group at a time as it comes.
Interesting. Thank you. Marion?
Yeah, well, at the conference board, Sarah, we did do a survey of member companies who are very large employers in Europe, and they account for over 3 million employees. And we got about 85 responding. And I think what was interesting was that they had a lot of concerns about pay transparency and obviously about the directive itself in particular. And a lot of the concerns were around really sort of much more bureaucracy and time, and the need to pull together complex data that's probably scattered across many HR systems. So that was one, the very much just the time, the complexity, and the fact that at the individual state level you're going to have to figure out some of the differences and nuances. There was a lot of concern about the impact on pay. And interestingly, when we surveyed, we did a poll at a conference, and we did another poll for another event that we had, and very similar, sort of 75% or so of these people that we polled saying that they worried that pay was actually going to go up, and that there would be increased costs to the business. And why that is because really they felt that, well, if you're telling candidates this is the pay range, job candidates are going to say, well, we'll negotiate to be at the higher end of the pay range. Similarly, if you are being a lot more transparent about pay levels in the workplace, you're having to look at any differences between different groups, for equal pay for equal worth, etc., that this will all have an effect of pushing up pay a little bit. This might just be a short-term effect, but companies in Europe, we know from our C-suite global survey, companies in Europe are already worried about company costs and about labour costs in particular. And then thirdly, I think that the other cluster of concerns is around the talent implications. So some companies are really worried about saying, we have to talk about our salary ranges to our competitors.
Interesting. And do you think that increased pay transparency, when you're talking to our member companies, they're already seeing those that are underway and are kind of doing this, that they do see greater employee morale and productivity from this?
I think it's very early days for us in Europe, but we do have some companies that are pioneers, and and I will point to Novo Nordisk in Denmark, because they report on this in their sustainability report, but we've also talked to them a lot. And I think that companies that have been going down this route for some time are really, really committed to it. And they see it very much as part of the value of being an inclusive employer and a sustainable, orientated employer. So they link transparency to trust, to inclusion, to well-being. And I think it's quite interesting to see them putting it into that perspective. But there is, at the sort of national level, there are various different surveys, etc. And as Aaron said, there is some growing evidence saying that, pay transparency does contribute to employee engagement and motivation and job satisfaction, as long as you get it right. If you get it wrong, then it can stoke up resentment, and it can lead to people perhaps leaving the company in quest of a better salary. So, the stakes are quite high. Great benefits if you get it right, some serious disadvantages if you get it wrong.
We are going to take a short break, and please note that you can access Marion's report on pay transparency on our website. When we come back, we'll continue this discussion on the EU's Pay Transparency Directive, looking at it from regional perspectives.
Join us in Amsterdam on November 13th of this year for our Future Innovate and Transform conference, an event where tomorrow's ideas meet today's pioneering minds. Network with industry leaders, engage in dynamic discussions, and explore cutting-edge strategies to drive your organization forward. Don't miss your chance to be part of the change, lead the change, step into your potential, and embrace the future of business transformation. Secure your spot now. Visit www.conferenceboard.org/events and find Future Innovate and Transform. See you in Amsterdam.
Hello and welcome back to this conversation with Aaron Brown and Marion Devine. We're talking about pay transparency and the implications for business. I want to turn the discussion now to get perspectives on regional differences. So let me ask you both, what do you think are the key differences between how US, European companies view and act on pay transparency? Aaron.
US perspective, we've got in the past 5-6 years, states starting to put some of the rules out there, some of the laws, and what needs to be done with respect to pay transparency, disclosure, privacy, etc. And when we look about it company-wide, globally, we've got about half our workforce outside the U.S. The countries that we're in, and it is not in Europe, but the countries that we're in Asia, don't have a set of laws out there with respect to pay transparency. And so we went out with it in the U.S. a few years ago that we were going to post pay ranges for every level and every job. And then some of our other employees in other countries caught wind of this. They heard about it, and we welcome feedback. We ask employees what their needs and what their concerns are. And then we are hearing consistently that these countries also want the pay transparency that we're doing in the U.S. Mm-hmm. So without a history, without kind of the 5, 10, 20 years that both Europe and the U.S. have been going through with respect to transparency, it's a longer change management process. It takes a couple of years to start getting the employees used to the concept, slowly rolling out what the numbers might look like, the distribution of employees. So there's a lot of analysis, a lot of communication, a lot of change management in order to be able to get some sort of global consistency. And I think from the U.S. perspective, starting to see some of the state laws put in place 4, 5, 6 years ago and through today, it's a matter of, do we want to comply with only the state laws that are out there? Do you want to apply that more consistently across the U.S., or do you want to have a global approach? And then what's the way to get to that end game that you want to align, as we were mentioning in the first part of the episode, to the culture of the company? And I think if you want a global culture, you really need to consider strongly putting in a global approach on pay transparency. And so we're in the middle of doing that and getting a lot of good traction so far, and feel that in the next couple of years we'll be able to have that consistency and make sure employees understand where they are and what the pay ranges and pay levels are.
Interesting. Marion?
Well, I think it's a hard question to answer, actually, Sarah, but I think from the discussions that we're having at the conference board, I dare to say that I think that in some ways European companies have been a little bit slow off the starting block of realizing that, this directive is here, it will be law in June 2026, and they really need to be preparing for it. And I think in a way in Europe, because there's already been some laws about gender pay gap reporting, laws here, there and everywhere in different countries, I wonder if companies are thinking that they are a bit better prepared than they really are. So I think our conversations suggest that companies are being a little bit slow off the mark. I think there's a slight tendency to have a kind of regulatory compliance mindset as well. It's another piece of regulation that's come into Europe.
I mean, it sounds to me like there's a lot of alignment and engagement with stakeholders within the company that's really needed to make the most of this. You've got the legal teams, you've got Total Rewards, you've got the DEI teams, you've got internal communications, you've got people analytics so that you can get all of the data, and then you've got the talent management. So it really does need to be an enterprise-wide change management initiative, doesn't it? Because there's so many aspects that really need to be considered here.
Sarah, I think that's exactly right. You've got to have a lot of functions kind of come together to figure this out. And I would say you also can bring in some of the leadership of different cohorts, different groups within the company. We've got a consistent approach that's applied to the situation, and it applies across. It doesn't matter what gender, race, ethnicity, etc. And so you can take some of that concern and anxiety out of the equation. And then once they're bought in, once they understand how things work, then they can lead that message and make sure that people are comfortable as almost as a third party to the group that's kind of running the pay transparency technical side of things. And it makes for a much easier transition, easier change management. Employees trust the leadership of the groups that they belong to, and we found that to work exceptionally well.
Indeed. Do you see, like the cultural attitudes towards salary disclosure? Do you see that vary across the states, Aaron, or across, the different countries, in which you're operating? And, has that had an impact on adopting, the changes that you wanted to make?
So we have employees that are working together fairly spread out across the U.S. in a number of both cities and regions, north, south, east, west, down the middle. And because we're used to working together, and even whether it's the same level or within the same function, we're still fairly spread out. And because of that, we've got a fairly consistent perspective and view on wanting pay transparency, thinking it's the right thing to do. And we've got company values like caring is one of the 6 values that we espouse, and our consistency with that value, with our culture, is what people expect also. So I think because we're spread out, because we have a flexible work arrangement for employees in both where they work and how they work and the hours that they work, I think we're used to having a similar approach and view and perspective on the DEI, more anchored to our values and our company culture than more of like a geographical differences that may be out there.
Right. Got it. Marion, anything you want to add?
Well, I think this whole thing about cultural attitudes towards pay transparency is actually very complex, and we see a lot of difference in Europe just across to how people think about pay and money and privacy. So I think it's very complex. I think that at the moment there's a bit of an assumption that you can go back to good old frameworks like Hofstede's cultural frameworks, where the more individualistic a culture is, the more people are going to be very happy and comfortable negotiating and being transparent. The lower levels of higher levels of being very collective or harmonious culture, etc. But actually some research is saying, well, do you know what, it doesn't appear to be based on those sort of obvious cultural markers. Actually, how people feel about pay transparency is more complex, it's more nuanced, it's more individual and personal. And so the moral of the story really, I think, is that companies need to really do a lot of employee listening.
I think it's a really interesting point that you've both made, though, that ultimately the C-suite teams, they're going to have to decide the business future policy, either comply with the regional pay transparency and legislation, or build this global framework, for example, using the EU directive as that benchmark, or go beyond, compliance to just really embed it in the culture, in the values, in the processes and in the DNA, of an organisation. So there's a real opportunity, isn't there? There's a real opportunity for companies to ask themselves, what type of company do we want to be? Yeah.
That's right. And then you don't. There are ways to handle the potential concerns of rising the pay company wide to address some of the pay equity. Like for example, we get budgets, salary budgets, and within the annual budget for the increases that we apply to different countries separately, we embed some pay equity numbers into that, and that it
Yeah.
can include promotional increases, it can include results or changes that we need to make from any kind of pay equity analysis that we've done recently, and so you can adjust for this and still have a workforce that feels that it's fairly implemented across the world.
Yeah. So, Marion, you're obviously talking to a lot of companies, and in writing this report, spoke to several leaders. What best practices, have really struck you that companies have adopted to ensure that, the initiatives are both effective and sustainable? What's really impressed you?
I think it depends, Sarah, on where companies are, but there's a lot of work to be done. So there's an awful lot about putting your processes in order. So really making sure that all your job architectures, your policies, your procedures are all in good state for transparency. So that's a really important part of it. Pulling together data, good quality data, is a really important part of it, so that you can do reporting, and you can also explain should you be asked to talk about some of those results. But I think what's really important, and this is where the companies that are further advanced is around, as you said, training of leaders, anyone who's involved in either recruiting and offering, some sort of pay package, or negotiating through performance management. So really making sure that you have trained and equipped your leaders, your managers, to hold those conversations and to do it in a positive way, and to be upholding, the values, the behaviors that you want associated with transparency. I think that whole cultural shift is incredibly important.
Marion, I think that's exactly right. If you do it right, the leaders will actually carry the torch for you. I mean, they're the cheerleader. They, first of all, they believe it, they understand it, they've gone through the data, the analysis, they understand the surveys, the ranges, etc. And what we found is that they will actually help the employees, the workforce at the front line, uh, get comfortable that this is the right thing to do. They're paid correctly, and it's a good, fair approach that is consistent.
So, as we wrap up this discussion, let me ask you both one final question. What are the key takeaways from this conversation do you think business leaders need to know?
Be open. But we're talking about pay transparency, but it really is being transparent, and it's being transparent globally, is being transparent at all levels, including the board. Let them know what you're doing, and as long as you've got the employee's best interest in mind, and you want to help everybody understand this better. That includes leadership, all the way down to the rank and file front line, then you're going to end up being okay. And you can always change. In fact, couch it that way. Like, let people know that we're trying to get better here. We want to be open. We want everybody to understand our programs, and we may change, and we probably will change. So it's a living, breathing process, set of documents, approach that we're going to try different things out, and we're just going to get better over time. And I think with that kind of mentality and that kind of approach to communicating to people, they'll give you the grace. They'll be more willing to listen, more willing to understand and trust that you're doing the right thing.
Marion?
think it's hard to add to that. I absolutely agree with what Marion said, and I think it is sort of, you can take a very sort of minimalistic, a reluctant, well, I'm going to comply, but I think you'd be really missing the point. You'd be missing the opportunity. There is a global momentum behind pay transparency. There is momentum in terms of, younger employees want to see inclusive workplaces. There are many compelling reasons to do this and to do it fulsomely and wholeheartedly. So I think that's what I would really say as a takeaway.
Well, that brings us to the end of this episode of Let's Talk Global Business. We'll be back next time with a focus on a new topic. You can find Marion's report and listen to the entire catalogue of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at conference-board.org. Thank you, Marion and Aaron, for sharing your insights with us. And until next time, let's talk global business.